In the spring of 2009, a salvage broker named Holt Brewer walked a retired millman named Cecil Vass around a collapsed tobacco barn on a rented parcel outside Yancey County, North Carolina. The barn had come down the previous February under a wet snow load, and the timber was lying in a heap, gray-faced and bark-peeling, dressed in a decade of lichen and the smell of split wood souring in winter air. Holt was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, with a moisture analyzer and a commercial grading rubric and a spreadsheet he trusted absolutely. And he told Cecil the pile was worth $200 as firewood, plus $20 to haul it. Cecil did not argue. He wrote the check without putting on his reading glasses, folded it twice, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. What Holt Brewer did not know, and would not have known how to see even if he had been standing on top of it in full light, was that the single largest timber in that pile was something his training had never equipped him to find. It was a 12 by 12 white oak beam, 14 feet long and still solid at the core, quartersawn from a tree that had been standing on that ridge before the Civil War. The medullary ray flecks on its face were wide as a man's thumb and bright as hammered copper, buried under a quarter-inch of gray, weathered surface. The beam had not rotted. It had cured slowly under a roof that finally gave way to a snow year, and when Cecil split the weathered skin with a timber scraper that afternoon, the wood underneath was as hard and figured and true as anything a furniture maker in western North Carolina had ever handled. That beam alone would eventually sell for $9,400 to a custom millwork shop in Weaverville. And that story, the story of how Cecil Vass could see what Holt Brewer could not, is what I want to tell you. If you have ever watched a careful person read something the fast eye cannot find, you already know the shape of it. The details are what matter. Let me tell you what kind of man Cecil Vass was, because the knowing does not make sense without the man who holds it. He was 63 years old in 2009, and he was known in Henderson County for two things: his silence and his hands. He had worked the paper mill trade from age 18 to age 58, running planers and jointers and the occasional wide-belt sander for the better part of 4 decades in the same facility outside Hendersonville. He was not a famous craftsman. He was a careful one, the kind of man who recalibrated his equipment each morning before the shift started and could hear a blade going slightly out of true before the quality control charts showed anything. When the mill closed in 2003, he did not retrain for another trade or collect the severance and sit. He drove home to the 12 acres he owned outright in a holler south of Edneyville, cleared out a small equipment shop his father had left standing behind the house, and started buying old wood, not antique furniture, not collector's pieces with provenance papers. Raw structural timber from barns, tobacco cures, granaries, old church frames, collapsed outbuildings from farms that had sold to developers or been abandoned when the owners died without heirs willing to take the ground. He bought the wood cheaply because he drove slowly through areas other buyers did not bother with, because he looked at timber other brokers had dismissed, and because 4 decades in a mill had given him a physical literacy with wood that no program and no instrument teaches. He resold to furniture makers, custom flooring shops, specialty builders, and occasionally to a craftsman who had heard about him through a chain of word that was itself a kind of proof. One satisfied buyer who told another, county by county, across the mountains. He drove a 1987 Ford pickup with 180,000 miles on it. The passenger seat held a canvas bag with a timber scraper, a wire brush, a moisture probe, a folding rule, and a pocket notebook he had been using since 1989. He wore the same canvas work coat from October through April. He did not have a website. He did not have a warehouse. What he had was the 12 acres, the shop, and 40 years of looking at wood. Holt Brewer, by contrast, had all of the instruments. He was the regional acquisitions manager for a timber salvage brokerage based in Asheville. A company with a warehouse, a truck fleet, a web presence, and accounts with 3 regional flooring distributors. He had a forestry degree from Appalachian State and 7 years of experience grading and pricing reclaimed dimensional lumber for commercial resale. He was 44 years old, trim, articulate, and genuinely trying to do his job well. He had a moisture analyzer that cost $650 and gave readings in 3 seconds, and a tablet computer running a grading application he had helped the company develop. He could process a 2-acre barn collapse in an afternoon, assign grade values to every stick, calculate a fair market price for the aggregate, and have a purchase order ready before he left the site. He was not a bad man. He was, the narrator wants to say this plainly, a sincere and diligent person who believed, in the way that well-trained people believe things, that the instruments were measuring what mattered. He had been trained in a system that prized speed and volume and standardization, and that system had never failed him in any way he could name. The gap in his training was not a gap he could see, because the things it left invisible were the things the system had never told him to look for. Cecil paid Holt the $220, loaded the pile himself over 3 afternoons with a borrowed utility trailer, and drove it 40 miles south to Edneyville. Now let me tell you about Quartersawn timber, because the mechanism is the whole story, and because the mechanism is exactly what Holt Brewer's instruments could not read. When a sawmill cuts a log flat sawn, which means running the log in parallel planks, tangential to the growth rings, it produces wide boards quickly with very little waste. The face grain that results is the pattern most people recognize as wood grain, long arching ovals and cathedral figures running down the length of the board. It is beautiful in its way. It is also the grain pattern that moves the most with changes in seasonal humidity, cupping and checking as the wood breathes. Flat sawn lumber is what the commercial market is built on because the method is fast, efficient, and produces predictable, gradable product in volume. A trained buyer can assess it from the surface in 30 seconds. When a sawmill cuts a log quartersawn, the log is first split into 4 quarters, and each quarter is positioned, so the growth rings run roughly perpendicular to the saw's path through the wood. The result is a board or timber whose face exposes the medullary rays of the tree, the cellular structures that run radially from the pith outward at a nearly perpendicular angle to the surface. In certain species, and especially in white oak, the medullary rays are wide and densely packed enough that when they appear on a face-cut surface, they produce a shimmering, lustrous figure of silver and copper-colored flecks and rippled patches that craftsmen call ray figure or tiger figure in its most pronounced form. The wood is dimensionally more stable than flat sawn material, less prone to cupping and warping through seasonal movement, which is one reason it was specified for fine cabinetry and architectural millwork for more than a century. Quartersawn white oak was the signature material of the American arts and crafts movement. The Stickley workshops were built on it. Gustav Stickley's own furniture was built on it. Prairie School architects used it for built-in cabinetry and paneling because it held its dimension through the swing of Midwestern seasons. After the Second World War, as engineered sheet goods and flat-sawn softwoods took over the construction industry, and as the old-growth timber that produced the widest and brightest ray figure was largely exhausted, Quartersawn white oak became a specialty material, expensive to produce, harder and harder to source, and still sought by the furniture makers and architectural millwork shops that had clientele willing to pay for it. What Cecil's father had taught him, on walks through barns and spring houses across Henderson and Buncombe counties in the late 1960s and 1970s, was that old-growth trees had a cellular density that second-growth trees do not. A white oak tree that had grown slowly in a closed canopy for 150 years had medullary rays wide enough that even a structural timber never surfaced for appearance would show its figure clearly once the gray, weathered skin was removed. The barn builders of the 19th century did not quartersawn timber because they were making furniture. They did it in some cases because the timber was simply what the tree gave them when they ran it through the pit saw, and because the quartersawn cut produced a more stable structural member in a climate with significant seasonal humidity swings. The figure was incidental to them. It is not incidental to a furniture maker 140 years later. The key to reading it, his father had written in the notebook in 1974, is the surface scrape. You do not measure old timber with an instrument. You remove the weather with a clean blade and look at what is underneath. Ring count at the end grain tells you the age of the tree and something about its density. Weight to dimension ratio, felt in the hands, tells you whether the interior is sound. And the ray figure on the face, once the gray is off, tells you what kind of tree it was and whether you are holding something rare. These are not difficult things to do. They are simply things that take time, and time is what the commercial grading system cannot afford. Cecil pulled the big timber into the light on the second afternoon of sorting. It was the longest and heaviest piece in the pile, and he had been moving around it carefully, the way you move around something you are not ready to look at squarely. He got it up on two sawhorses and stood back. The gray face gave nothing away. He picked up the wire brush and went over the surface twice to knock off the loose lichen and the bark fragments, and then he took the timber scraper, a heavy Swedish tool his father had used, and drew it down the face of the beam from one end to the other in one long, slow stroke. He stopped. His son Dale was in the shop that afternoon, helping him sort and stack the smaller pieces. Dale was 26, back from 2 years at Western Carolina University, where he had started and then abandoned a business management degree, and he was working with his father partly out of obligation and partly because he had no better plan yet. He was skeptical of the enterprise in the particular way of a young person who has been told that old methods are old methods and that the future belongs to people who understand scale and supply chains and brand equity. He had said to Cecil on more than one occasion that there was no durable business in chasing one-off finds in other people's barn debris, that the real money in reclaimed timber was in branded product with consistent quality, in volume, in a proper warehouse, and a company name people could trust. Cecil had listened each time and said nothing and gone back to work. When Cecil stopped moving at the sawhorses, Dale looked up from the stack he was building near the back wall. Cecil was standing with the scraper hanging at his side, looking at the timber. He did not move for a long time. Dale set down what he was holding and walked over. The beam face where the scraper had passed was a strip about 5 inches wide and 8 feet long, and it was covered in ray figure, so dense and consistent that even Dale, who had not grown up looking for it, could see it was something different. The flecks caught the afternoon light from the side window and threw back a copper and silver sheen, patterned and regular as hammered metal. "What is that?" Dale said. "Quartersawn white oak," Cecil said. He set the scraper on the bench and walked to the end of the timber and crouched down to look at the end grain. He counted rings slowly, moving his lips. He stood back up. "Old-growth tree," he said. 18 rings to the inch, maybe more at the pith. Dale looked at the end grain. He could see the rings, tight as thread. How old? Cecil did the arithmetic in the way he had learned it, the way his father had taught him to do it, not as a calculation, but as a reading. The tree at that density and at the diameter this timber required had been standing for somewhere between 140 and 180 years when it was felled. The mortise and tenon joinery on the other timbers from the same barn was hand-cut, which put the construction in the 1870s or 1880s. The tree had probably been alive before the country was a country. Cecil walked out to the truck. He came back with the pocket notebook. He wrote down the dimensions of the beam, the ring count, the visible extent of the ray figure, and the date. He wrote the word Quartersawn and the word tiger and circled both. He put the notebook back in his coat pocket. "How much is it worth?" Dale said. Cecil looked at the beam for another moment. "More than $200, he said. In the weeks that followed, Cecil cleaned and probed and sorted the rest of the pile. The majority of it was what Holt had priced it as: sound white oak and hickory, structurally solid but nothing with figure, suitable for flooring-grade resale or milling into dimensional lumber stock. Cecil sold that material to a reclaimed flooring dealer in Weaverville for a fair price. He pulled the 12 by 12 aside and stood it against the shop wall under a tarp, where it waited while Cecil made a phone call. He called a furniture maker in Spruce Pine who had bought tiger maple from him the previous summer, and the furniture maker gave him the name of Roy Beam, who ran a custom millwork shop in Weaverville and was the kind of buyer who would understand what he was looking at. Cecil called Roy on a Wednesday. Roy asked 3 questions. Then he said he would drive out the following Tuesday. He came in a clean pickup, not a company truck, and wore boots that had seen mud before. He was about 40, quiet with the particular economy of movement of a person who works with their hands at very close tolerances. He walked into the shop and looked at the timber standing against the wall. Cecil had left the scraped strip visible on the face, so the figure showed. Roy crossed the shop and stood in front of it. He crouched down and looked at the figure from a low angle, a craftsman's angle, reading the surface the way you read cloth for nap and weave. He stood and checked the end grain, running his finger along the ring count. He put the flat of his hand against the face of the timber and held it there. "How far does the figure run?" he said. "Full length," Cecil said. "I probed for checking at the interior." "It's clean?" Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the beam from one end, sighting down it. "I'll take it at $1.10 a board foot of finished yield," he said. "My mill, my calculation after servicing. I'll write the yield sheet and mail you a copy with the check." Cecil did the math he had already done. At $1.10 a board foot, assuming the interior held the way the probe said it would and the figure ran consistent the way the scrape suggested, the check would be somewhere between $9,000 and $10,000. He had paid $220 for the pile that contained it. He looked at the timber and then at Roy. "Fair enough," he said. Roy drove out with the beam on a Tuesday in November, wrapped in moving blankets in the bed of his truck. There was a man named Gerald Webb, who operated a salvage brokerage about 40 miles north in Polk County, and his operation was everything Cecil's was not: capitalized, visible, fast, and built on volume. Gerald had come to the reclaimed timber business from building materials distribution, and he ran his yard with the same methods he had run his distribution routes, which meant he needed product he could move in quantity to buyers who could absorb it in quantity. He had a warehouse with a planer on site that could surface several thousand board feet a day. He had a straight truck fleet. He had a website with clean photography. He sold milled reclaimed flooring to interior designers and renovation contractors who wanted the visual aesthetic of old material without the variability and unpredictability of truly old material, because truly old material was not consistent enough for their project timelines. In 2007, Gerald grossed $814,000 in reclaimed flooring and paneling. He drove a truck less than 2 years old. He was, by any commercial metric, outperforming Cecil Vass by a factor that would have embarrassed Cecil if Cecil had been the kind of man who thought in those terms, which he was not. Gerald had visited Cecil's shop twice. The first time, in 2006, he made a clean offer to absorb Cecil's inventory and put him on a procurement salary, which would have meant Cecil finding material for Gerald's mill at prices Gerald set. Cecil declined without elaborating. The second time, in 2008, Gerald came to look at a batch of American chestnut timbers Cecil had sourced from a collapsed spring house in Madison County. Timber of genuine rarity, since the chestnut blight of the early 20th century had eliminated the species from the eastern forest, and sound old-growth chestnut structural timber was almost never available in any commercial channel. Gerald offered 40 cents a board foot. Cecil knew the material was worth at least 90 cents to a careful buyer with the right market. He said no. Gerald left both times with his truck clean, and his contract offers intact, and his opinion of Cecil's business unchanged, which was that it was a hobby at a scale that happened to pay its own bills. By the winter of 2010, Gerald had a line of credit at 2 regional banks, a $40,000 inventory in his warehouse, and a renegotiated distributor contract that had come down 12% from the previous year. The renovation market had softened badly with the housing crisis, and the kind of contractors who had been his reliable buyers were either sitting on projects or chasing tighter budgets. Gerald was not in immediate trouble, but he had borrowed against future inventory to hold his cash position during the slow period, and slow periods in a high-volume, low-margin business compress very quickly into real trouble. He did not discuss this publicly. It moved through the community of salvage dealers the way these things do. An overheard conversation, a missed payment on a supply account, a truck sitting idle in the yard for a week. Dale heard about it from a flooring dealer he had been talking to in Buncombe County. He mentioned it to Cecil one evening in the shop. Cecil listened and said nothing. Roy Beam called from Weaverville on a Thursday morning in December 2009. He had finished the milling. The beam had yielded 9,412 board feet of finished Quartersawn white oak with consistent medullary ray figure throughout, excepting 14 inches at one end that had checked out and been written off as waste. The figure was what the scrape had promised. Wide even, clear all the way through. Roy said it was the best piece of white oak he had handled in 12 years of custom millwork. He mailed the check the same day he called. $9,412. Cecil set the envelope on the kitchen table that evening without opening it. Dale opened it. He unfolded the check and set it under the light of the overhead lamp, which was the same porcelain fixture that had hung in that kitchen since Dale was 4 years old. He looked at the number for a while. Then he looked up at his father, who was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. "The 200 you paid Holt," Dale said. "$220, Cecil said. "He charged for the hauling." Dale set the check down on the table and pushed it toward the center, as though he did not want to be holding it. "How do you see that in a pile?" he said. "From the outside, looking at gray wood." Cecil pulled the pocket notebook from his coat and set it on the table in front of Dale. He opened the front cover. Inside, written in pencil in his father's handwriting, which had faded to the color of pencil lead pressed very lightly, was a list of 12 observations to make when evaluating a structural timber for possible old-growth Quartersawn stock. The list had a date at the top, September 1974. Cecil had been watching his father read barn timber since he was 7 years old. He had been doing it himself for 40 years. Dale read the list slowly. He read it a second time. He asked about 3 of the entries, and Cecil explained each one, standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee. The specific feel in the hands of a cured old-growth timber versus green or punky wood. The ring count that told you whether you were holding a fast-grown second-growth stick or something from a tree that had taken 150 years to reach the size the timber required. The weight-to-dimension ratio that a moisture probe alone would never reveal. The scraper test. The low-angle look at the figure before you ever measured anything. The way the gray face of weathered oak could hide almost anything, including something worth $9,400 to the right buyer, if you moved too fast and measured only what the instruments could reach. Dale listened without interrupting. He asked good questions when Cecil finished. The overhead light was warm, and outside the shop the night was cold and clear, and the 12 acres were quiet. Holt Brewer heard about the Yancey County timber in February 2010, the way these things travel in a trade where people talk at auctions and over lunch counters. A word from someone who had heard from Roy Beam's shop in Weaverville, who had mentioned it to a flooring dealer, who had mentioned it at a salvage auction in Buncombe County, where Holt was bidding on a barn collapse. He sat with it for 3 weeks. Then he drove down to Edneyville on a Tuesday morning in March. Cecil was in the shop running a hand plane along a piece of tulip poplar when Holt came in. He did not stop planing. Holt stood inside the door with his tablet under his arm. He had not dressed down for the visit, which meant he was wearing his work clothes, which were clean compared to Cecil's. He said, "I heard about the beam from the Yancey barn." Cecil kept planing. "I'd like to understand what I missed," Holt said, "if you're willing." He said it plainly with no qualifier and no defensiveness, and that was the thing about Holt that Cecil had noticed from the first time they met. He was a person who wanted to understand things correctly, more than he wanted to be right about them. He had made a fair offer for what his training and instruments showed him, and what they had shown him had turned out to be the wrong part of the timber. He was not there to renegotiate. He was there because he was a serious person and serious people, when their model produces a significant error, need to trace the error back to its source. Cecil set the plane down. He took the pocket notebook from his coat and set it on the bench beside the plane. Then he went to the shelf along the back wall and found a piece of board he had kept from Roy Beam's milling, a sample about 2 feet long with the Quartersawn ray figure running full and clear across the face, the copper and silver light sitting in it, even in the dim of the shop. He set the sample on the workbench and told Holt to look at the face from a low angle. Holt crouched and looked. He stood. Cecil handed him the notebook. "Read that list," Cecil said. Holt read it. He was quiet for a moment. 12 items, he said. "Your father wrote these?" "He had a teacher," Cecil said. "I don't know who." Over the next hour, Cecil walked Holt through each of the 12 items with the sample board and with a few other pieces he pulled from the storage racks, explaining the mechanism behind each observation. Why ring count predicts figure in white oak. Why the weight-to-dimension ratio of an old-growth timber differs from a second-growth timber of comparable dimension in a way you feel in the hands before the probe tells you anything. Why the commercial grading scale does not capture any of this, because the commercial grading scale was built for volume and speed and the particular kind of consistency that allows for automated processing. Holt took notes on his tablet. He asked good questions, the questions of a person genuinely trying to revise their model rather than defend it. At the end, he said that he understood better now why his process had missed it, and that he was going to add a physical inspection step to his site assessment protocol. Cecil walked him to the truck. "One thing," Cecil said. "Holt turn." "The moisture analyzer's fine for what it measures," Cecil said. "Just don't stop there." Holt nodded. He drove back to Asheville. By that fall, something had quietly shifted in the small economy of barn timber salvage in the western counties. 3 dealers from Henderson, Madison, and Buncombe came to Cecil's yard in the months after the Yancey County story circulated, not to purchase material, but to ask him to walk them through a pile they had acquired and could not confidently grade. Cecil did it, each time, without charging for the consultation beyond his gas. He was not building a teaching practice. He was doing what he did, which was to look at timber carefully and tell the truth about what was in it. The fact that other people wanted to watch while he did it was not a thing he had sought. Gerald Webb's operation failed in the spring of 2011. It failed in the particular quiet way of a business that has borrowed at thin margins through a long, soft market. The lender called the note. The inventory could not move fast enough to satisfy, and the warehouse sale did not cover the full exposure. Gerald sold the fleet and the warehouse and the distributor contract, paid his obligations as fully as he was able, and took a position with a building supply company in Spartanburg. He was not destroyed, and the narrator wants to be clear about that. He was a capable businessman who had built a capable business on a model that assumed steady volume in a renovation market that had contracted badly and quickly through 2009 and 2010, and he had borrowed against that assumption until a lender who understood balance sheets better than Gerald understood market cycles decided the note was overdue. The flooring distributor's renegotiation, the 12% reduction in his contract rate, had come in the same quarter Gerald's 2 largest contractor accounts had put projects on hold. He had managed the cash for almost 18 months before the position became untenable. 18 months is not reckless. It is the duration of a person who believes his model will return to its prior condition and is simply waiting it out. Cecil heard about it through the same quiet channel that had brought the earlier rumors of stress, a word at a salvage auction in Madison County from a dealer who had done business with Gerald's yard. Cecil listened and said nothing. He felt the thing that is correct to feel for a person who pursued a legitimate path and was corrected by an impersonal force rather than a personal failure. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a plain recognition that the structural shock does not discriminate between the careless and the careful. Gerald had been careful inside his model. The model had been built for conditions that changed. That is not Gerald's specific failure. That is what happens when resilience has been traded for efficiency across a long enough period that the trade becomes invisible. Cecil had not traded that way, not because he had predicted what would happen to Gerald, but because the model Cecil had inherited from his father was constitutionally incapable of the kind of volume and leverage Gerald's model required. You cannot borrow against future inventory when your inventory is one 12 by 12 beam in a pile that cost you $220. You cannot scale the particular kind of seeing Cecil had built because it requires time and physical contact with every piece and a lifetime of accumulated calibration that does not transfer easily or quickly. The limitation that had made Cecil's operation look small to Gerald was the same limitation that made it survive what Gerald's did not. Cecil had never found a way to explain this to Gerald, partly because Gerald had never asked, and partly because it is very difficult to explain a structural advantage that looks, from the outside, like an incapacity. Dale spent the next 2 years working in the shop alongside his father, and his work there was different from anything he had brought back from Western Carolina. The business management curriculum had taught him to look at a business as a system of inputs, processes, and outputs, measurable at each stage and improvable at any point where data revealed a bottleneck. What he found in the shop was something the curriculum had no vocabulary for: a practice, not a process, one where the inputs could not be standardized and the process depended on a kind of accumulated physical intelligence that resisted being broken into steps. He could not build a flow chart for how Cecil read a timber pile. He could only stand beside him and watch. He kept the notebooks his grandfather had kept, and he added things his grandfather had not had the tools to add. He kept digital photographs of ray figure indexed to ring counts and source location, a log of every acquisition with the seller's name and the property provenance and what the seller had believed they were selling, the buyer's name and what they paid and what they ultimately made from the material. He built a map of source locations in Henderson, Yancey, Mitchell, Madison, and Buncombe counties, tracking which farm sales and estate settlements were generating salvageable timber and which types of structures historically contained the material worth looking for carefully. He cross-referenced ring counts with property records to identify old-growth tracts that had been cleared in the 19th century and built into structures that were now collapsing. This was not a business model in the sense his business management professors would have recognized. It was a record, and a record of a particular kind, the kind that makes invisible knowledge visible over time. Cecil watched him at it in the evenings after they had closed the shop, the laptop open on the kitchen table, where the overhead lamp reached it, the end-grain photographs lined up in sequence on the screen. One night, sorting through a batch of samples Dale had photographed and labeled that afternoon, Cecil picked up the printout of a white oak end grain and looked at it carefully for a moment, turning it in the light. He set it down. "Your grandfather would have done this," he said, "if anyone had thought to sell him a camera." Roy Beam came back to Cecil's yard in 2013 with a commission for a dining table from a piece of American chestnut that Cecil had sourced from a collapsed mill building in Mitchell County the previous fall. He paid $840 for a slab 14 inches wide and 7 feet long, sound and tight grain through the full length, with the particular warm amber color and the fine, even grain of old chestnut that no other North American species produces. The American chestnut was effectively eliminated as a forest species by the blight of the early 20th century. An old-growth chestnut structural timber, the kind that had been standing in buildings long enough to cure past any structural use but not yet converted to firewood or rot, was available almost nowhere in commercial channels. You found it the way Cecil found it, which was by knowing what kind of structures had been built, in which kinds of places, in which decades, and by driving slowly through the right counties in the right years and looking at what was falling down. Roy built the table and sold it to an architect in Asheville for $4,200, he called Cecil to tell him. Not because Cecil had any claim on the downstream price, but because Roy felt the information was the kind that belonged to the person who had first seen the value, and because he was the kind of craftsman who understood that the chain from standing tree to finished table included more people than the one holding the plane at the end. Cecil wrote the number down in the notebook, under the date, the way he wrote everything down. The record was not for any audience. It was the kind of record a person keeps when they have been taught that the information in a piece of material is worth tracking carefully, because tracking it carefully is how you learn to read the next piece better. By 2014, Dale had started accompanying Cecil on acquisition trips, and he had developed enough of his father's physical literacy to make himself useful in the field. Not yet able to read a pile as Cecil could, but able to see the things the scraper revealed, to count rings without losing the count, to feel the difference in weight between a sound core and a timber that had checked internally past the point of usability. He was learning it the way his father had learned it from his grandfather, which was by doing it in the presence of someone who had already done it 10,000 times. There is no shorter path through that kind of knowledge. The notebook helps. The hands have to follow. There is something precise that the Yancey County beam demonstrates, and it is not that luck finds treasure in unlikely places. Cecil Vass had paid $220 for a pile of timber containing $9,000 of value that a trained commercial grader had assessed and dismissed, and the reason Cecil saw it had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with 80 years of patient looking, his and his father's combined, accumulated in the pages of a pocket notebook and in the calibration of hands that had handled tens of thousands of pieces of wood. The mechanism that produced the seeing was a list of 12 observations, each one earned by time and repetition, each one invisible to an instrument that measured only what the commercial market had told it to care about. What Holt Brewer's moisture analyzer measured was real and accurate. The surface condition of the timber was exactly what his eye reported. He was not wrong about the data. He was wrong about which category of data contained the value. And that is the particular failure mode of a knowledge system built for speed and volume and standardization, one that cannot see what it has not been built to look for, and it moves too fast to look twice. The commercial salvage market is not a corrupt system. It is a system designed to process abundant, gradable material efficiently, and within that purpose it works. The 12 by 12 Quartersawn white oak beam was not abundant, not easily gradable, and not efficiently processed. It was one-of-a-kind material in a pile of ordinary material, and its value was available only to a person who had been trained over decades to slow down in front of things that look ordinary. Dale still has the pocket notebook. It sits on a shelf in the shop above the row of his father's hand planes, which hang from a strip of wooden pegs on the wall. When he takes on an apprentice now, and he has taken on 2 in the past 4 years, he does not begin with the notebook. He puts a timber scraper in the apprentice's hand and takes them to a pile of salvage and tells them to start at the gray face and see what is underneath. The notebook comes later, after the apprentice has been surprised at least once by the difference between what they expected and what the wood showed them. The list in the front cover is still in his grandfather's handwriting, still legible, still the 12 things. What holds through a snow year and a housing crash and a renegotiated distributor contract is not the model that runs fastest. It is the knowledge that was built slowest, in the closest contact with the material itself, by a person who understood that what is easy to measure and what is worth measuring are 2 different questions. Cecil Vass sold 3 more pieces of Quartersawn old-growth timber in the years that followed, each one found in a pile some faster eye had passed over, each one sold to a buyer who understood what they were holding. He did not call these discoveries. He called them the ordinary result of looking carefully. That is what patient knowledge does. It compounds, season by season, in the same direction, and it pays off in a number that lands differently than any projection. Some timber looks exactly like firewood, and some does not.